want to give you a hug. Thank you for this. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. It's really great to see so many people in the room, some who I've already interacted with and engaged with. I want to start out by thanking Dr. Melissa Shields Jenkins, for orchestrating this and inviting me here. She's been a mentor of mine for the past 8 years and has taught me a lot about what it means to have a supportive person in your corner who is rooting for you at all times and helping you succeed. And so without her, not just because she invited me here, but also because I made it as far as this book goes and being on the tenure track, I don't know if I would be here at Wake Forest. So I really want to thank you, Melissa, for that. I also like to thank Judith Madera, Reggie Brown, the Dean Family Fund, the Departments of Theater and Dance, American Ethnic Studies, Early Modern and Medieval Studies, African American Studies, and the Humanities Institute for helping to sponsor this event. And I also want to highlight 2 more people. Dr. Olga Valbuena, whose class I got to teach today. And it was an amazing opportunity for me to just kind of pop into the Wake Forest community and engage with students who had a lot of really great questions. And so hopefully they can also help me with the answers that I might get today here as we finish up this talk. And so I want to thank the students as well. And then someone else I'd like to thank, who I know from the beginning of my start on the sort of tenure track path, is in the room, and that is Dr. Susan Harlan, who is a fellow NYU alumnus and also was very helpful in terms of mentoring me as I got my start in this profession. So thank you so much, Susan, and thank you for taking the time to be here. So today I want to do 2 things. I'm not doing a bait and switch, but I want to give you some context. And so I'm going to back up and orient you into the concepts from my book, and then bring you into the Othello chapter and the ideas there, so that you're not lost, but so that you can stay with me. And then, if time permits, I'll watch the clock. I'd like to show you also the virtual reality art gallery that I created as a complement to the book. As I told Dr. Valbuena's students today, I went to a Beyonce concert in 2018, and I was so enthralled with what she does with visuals and words, and I was like, I bet I could maybe try to do that with my book. And so I created this virtual reality art gallery as a complement to the book, and it's a publicly accessible resource. You don't need VR goggles to access it, but I thought of it as a way to show people how the book's concepts are operating, not just in art, but even you can see it in our real world, and I'm happy to talk about that too. So I'll jump into the preface to the book, which borrows from the title of the late rapper Sam Snead's rap song, You Better Recognize. And this preface is called, You Better Recognize Othering Whiteness. Within Shakespeare studies and literary studies, and outside of those realms, as in other academic disciplines, and within the real world, the white other matters. This figure is a covert tool for maintaining what Bell Hooks describes in Black Looks, Race and Representation as the dominator imperialist white supremacist capitalist patriarchal culture. Specifically, the white other contrasts with idealized hegemonic whiteness, reinforces popular and evolving stereotypes about racial blackness, and helps reify the imagined superiority of the whiteness defining what early modern scholar Peter Erickson calls white self-fashioning. More significantly, the white other indicates how attitudes towards whiteness are mediated through blackness, as in race, and black images, as in metaphorical. Whenever necessary, in order to reinforce the goodness and supremacy of hegemonic whiteness, images of blackness appear as distant or estranged from whiteness through the white other construct. In this book, I argue that such mediation creates racialized boundaries between white people along lines of superiority, inferiority, in-group, out-group, familiar social and psychological dichotomies of inclusion and exclusion that generate racialized harm. In so doing, the white other serves as proof that the commodification of blackness, often exploited as a dehumanized resource, can occur in a range of everyday locations and in the subtlest ways. In The Origin of Others, the great Toni Morrison observes that one learns othering not by lecture or instruction, but by example. It is that easy. One learns by example. Morrison adds that racial identification and exclusion did not begin or end with Black people. This reality helps make sense of how and why whiteness is itself a nuanced racial category. As philosopher Michel Foucault suggests in The History of Sexuality, the value of racial whiteness was determined and still is determined through exclusionary processes of othering that facilitated the differentiation of people along lines of blood and skin color. By design, this kind of estrangement occurs at Black people's expense, historically through violence of some kind. In a way, then, one could say that when Blackness, as in race, or Blackness metaphorically, collapses into privileged whiteness, it presumably reduces the latter and thus produces the image or the idea of the white other. If it is true that control over images is central to the maintenance of any system of racial domination, then one cannot deny that what audiences receive from Shakespearean drama participates in a racist dynamic that privileges whiteness and devalues Blackness. Although racially white, the white other at times, or always, can seem foreign and strange in comparison to whatever is deemed normal. In Shakespeare's tragedy Hamlet, for instance, the hero's emblematic Blackness, signified by his inky cloak and accompanying unmanliness, is disturbing, a stark contrast to his deceased father's celebrated valiant whiteness, which I discuss in my second chapter in the book. Shakespeare creates distance between those white people who conform to social expectations and norms and those who do not. The Macbeths are another good example of that. In other words, there are white people who register in these texts as more legitimate than others. A matter Patricia Akimi, a Shakespeare scholar, addresses in her article, Fair Bianca and Brown Kate. Those people who conform or act as exemplars of hegemonic whiteness are tolerated and even revered, as the play shows, whereas those who do not conform are shunned, killed, critiqued, expelled, and marginalized. Although quite different than a fictional figure like Shakespeare's Aaron from his play Titus Andronicus, the white other who occupies a liminal space between Black and white helps sustain the racial hierarchy because their whiteness does not conform to the ideal. Furthermore, the white other's role alleviates the need for significant inclusion of Black characters in Shakespeare's canon, since these racially white figures are strategically designed to embody Blackness of some kind. Undeniably, whiteness is a dominating force, the dominating force in the racial hierarchy. By aiding the white superiority narrative, the white other enables racial whiteness to become more noticeable, particularly the positive symbolism of whiteness. I say that because Shakespeare offers correctives to the troubled moments where the dominant culture's standards of whiteness are not upheld. For instance, the difference between Titus Andronicus's fair-skinned, virtuous Roman Lavinia and fair-skinned, lascivious Goth Tamara, whom we might consider socially dead because of her barbaric, blackened identity, because of Tamara's sexual association with Aaron, a Black Moor, and because of her defeated enemy status and her alien culture. Within Shakespearean drama, one can witness white privilege operating among groups of exclusively white people. Produced through a white supremacist orientation, such harder to detect operations of white privilege make the white other a powerful mechanism of white racial and racist construction. Occupying a space between whiteness and Blackness, the white other's presence generates and solidifies anti-Black sentiments. This figure is a literary and perhaps real force that transports ideas about white superiority and the metaphorical superiority of whiteness within a given place framework. With respect to anti-Blackness, othering whiteness also exposes what is wrong with promoting notions of colorblindness. Moreover, othering whiteness complements discourse suggesting that colorblindness is harmful in social, cultural, political, pedagogical, and theatrical practice. Shakespeare repeatedly embeds figurative blackness in his white characters or places blackness on their bodies somehow. Other characters then see this blackness and respond to it accordingly, negatively. They do not deny the presence of blackness because allowing it and acknowledging it benefits whiteness. The acknowledgement of the white other's blackness, I posit, induces symptoms of ontological insecurity because these other white characters destabilize white norms and generate racialized anxiety in the dominant culture. These moments of insecurity call attention to the privileging of whiteness as a dangerous trope. Moments of white privilege, or what Claudia Rankine has suggested we call white dominance, do not always register as such, since people are not conditioned to consider this phenomenon from an intra-racial standpoint. Shakespeare's white others ask you, dear reader, to do the hard anti-racist work. Regarding racial construction, the white other is generative from a critical standpoint because this figure's presence challenges the argument that race, as we understand it, is only a modern phenomenon denoting otherness or non-whiteness. Rather, as Shakespeare scholar Ian Smith explains, race as a worldly thing not only denotes a complex institutional, cultural, and intersubjective process, but also the collective exchanges and deliberations, the dialogues and conversations pursuant to racial literacy, whether through reading, scholarship, conference deliberations, classroom learning, or theatrical performance that envision fully invested participation, mobilization, and change. By revealing tears in whiteness, T-I-E-R-S, and sometimes through white tears, T-E-A-R-S, the white other exposes the intricate workings of white racial solidarity and complicates white supremacist ideologies. This figure reminds us that even in pre-modernity, in Shakespeare's time, not all whiteness was acceptable whiteness, as the plays that I examined in this book illustrate. Additionally, tearing whiteness erases the need for focusing exclusively on predominantly black characters to understand race or racism, or even the powerful impact of white centrality. The white other's presence shows that Shakespeare's plays have a vested interest in negatively critiquing a certain kind of whiteness that's simultaneously uplifting hegemonic whiteness. The plays, in a sense, police whiteness. And since attitudes towards white racial category are mediated through blackness in the dramatic literature, it goes without saying that these early modern texts add to the historical policing of blackness. Such policing occurs outside of the text, and it occurs because of these texts in black people's lived realities. The interconnected race relationships among Shakespeare's plays are united through whiteness. There is not one Shakespeare play that excludes white people. The white other emerges as a figure of symbolic racial difference. The white other is not born, only created or imagined or imaged, thus emphasizing the malleability and mutability of racial boundaries and constructions. Moreover, this figure is a social organizing tool that stabilizes attitudes established towards blackness, normalizing color-based racism, discourse, and of course, anti-blackness. Beyond contributing to developing racist discourse, what has perhaps made this figure a challenge for people to identify is its ability to be an absent presence. Although the white other exists in plain sight, scholars have not yet thoroughly reflected on this figure's role. Therefore, there is room to consider how plays that on the surface do not appear committed to perpetuating racism or engaging racism and white supremacy silently do that work that is as harmful as that which Othello does in front of and on its audience. This harm, in the form of anti-blackness that intersects with issues such as toxic masculinity, misogyny, sexism, and classism, to name a few, necessitates that anti-racist readers, teachers, performers, and activists call out the white other's hazardous presence. This harm necessitates that those who support the cause, those who support anti-racism, Choose to see and read the white other in its image on the page and on the world stage. This harm necessitates examination because of its dangerous ideological intent. Without conscientious interrogation, this kind of harm could one day mean and be the death of me. Simply put, the white other is a threat to our survival. And so that's the preface to the book, and I wanted to orient you into that before I start talking about Iago, who is certainly a representation of the white other, because I want you to be able to follow along with me as I'm thinking through these subjects. And so one more section, I'll just share part of it that I want to read with you, because this occurred to me actually during the pandemic one day when I was walking, because what else could we do? And I was listening to my iPod, and Michael Jackson, and for those who aren't familiar, he had a song from the early 90s called Black or White. And the hook from that song says that it doesn't matter if you're black or white. And so I take that and flip that in my introduction. And the title of this section is called, It Does Matter If You're Black or White Other. What does it mean to be black, white, or white other? And why does it matter? In 1991, the late global pop superstar Michael Jackson asserted in the chorus to his wildly popular song, Black or White, that it doesn't matter if someone is black or white. With black and white being the extreme ends of the racial hierarchy, the added implication, as suggested by the song's music video visuals, was that the racial backgrounds of everyone in between black and white do not matter either. Jackson's idealistic song followed significant 20th century social, political, and cultural moments that exposed the pervasiveness of global white supremacy and/or responses to it. And there I'm thinking about South African apartheid, the Harlem Renaissance, Brown versus Board of Education, the American Civil Rights Movement, the Black Arts Movement, and the Black Power Movement, to name a few. Moreover, Jackson's song emerged around another significant socio-political moment, such as the end of Nelson Mandela's lengthy imprisonment, the infamous Rodney King beating and the 1992 LA riots, and Jackson's racial equality anthem, which was created because of global and anti-black racism, today sounds more like confirmation of a hopeful dream deferred, especially in light of the 2012 killing of Trayvon Martin on my birthday, February 26th, and the 2013 inception of the Black Lives Matter movement that continues to be relevant and necessary and will be so indefinitely. Ironically, Jackson's Black or White exists precisely because race matters. Everything in between black and white matters too. And I think it's really important for us to keep that in mind as we go about our daily lives, because whether or not we like it or not, this isn't the house we built, so to speak, as the author of the book Cast says, but we live in it and we inherit all that it gives us, whether that's cracked floors, broken pipes, busted windows. And so it's up to us to figure out how to manage that and deal with it. And so moving from that, just to give you a sense of what does it mean to think about this notion of the white other and this divisions between whiteness and within whiteness, I'm now going to turn to my Othello chapter and read from that, as promised, and share those ideas with you. So the title of this chapter is called, of course, Hear Me, See Me, Sex, Violence, Silence, and Othello. And I decided to write this chapter because I'm very interested in thinking about the impact that sexual violence has on people in particular, but males especially. It's not as much a discussed topic because guys are taught from young ages mostly to be tough and strong and hard and deal with it, and boys don't cry and all that toxic stuff. And so I wanted to put in a chapter something that gets us thinking about the intersection of both gender, sexual violence, and of course race. And so I begin with an epigraph from June Jordan's poem About My Rights. And it says, I am not wrong, wrong is not my name. The white other is a necessary factor in the negotiation of whiteness. and the related perpetuation of anti-Blackness across what I call the intraracial color line. And this reality leads me to ask a serious question about a significant problem. If white people cannot exist in accord with one another, or even with themselves at the individual level, then what hope is there for non-white people, especially black people, who occupy the bottom of the racial hierarchy, to exist in accord with white people? In society and in Shakespeare's dramatic literature, white folks matter. And white matters often get prioritized because of the presumed superiority of whiteness and because of the alleged inferiority of blackness, which is used to define the white other's presence spiritually, sexually, psychologically, emotionally, morally, and even sartorially in terms of clothing. Therefore, as long as people continue distracting each other in their centuries-old quest to uphold white supremacy, nothing else, no one else can matter as much. Since learning to listen is a virtue that whiteness has often avoided, as Michael Eric Dyson asserts, I devote space here for the often unheard and often avoided voices, and I use Othello to critique whiteness along the interracial color line. I devote space in this chapter to explore further the deep gap between black and white by seeing and centering black personhood, all the while considering the interplay among violence, silence, sex, and race instigated by white conduct. Specifically, I want to highlight an under-discussed issue that reveals how the distance between black and white, a wedge stabilized by the interracial color line and the white other, has major psychological and physical consequences for a minority group often portrayed not as victims but as perpetrators of sexual violence, that group being men, specifically black men. White self-harm, white privilege, white dominance, and herd invisibility, key concepts of white identity formation, have ensured and ensured the racial asymmetry that favors white people when it comes to defining and identifying who gets to be a victim. By way of Othello, then, I want to reflect on what the reality of de-victimization means for black males by contemplating questions whose answers have tangible, psychological, and social impact. How do black males scream for centuries about their psychological, physical, and emotional pain, yet remain unseen and unheard? How do black boys and men simultaneously hold their collective breath, buried alive for centuries, yet not die? And what is the psychological price black males pay and have paid for being gagged victims of violence, physical, sexual, emotional, and domestic? The answers, in part, lie in Dr. Jennifer Lynn Stover's theorization of the sonic color line, a phenomenon that builds on W.E.B. Du Bois's articulations in The Souls of Black Folk and suggests that race is a fundamentally important ocular and aural, A-U-R-A-L, signifier that dictates how all racialized bodies are presented, perceived, processed, and even policed. Du Bois specifically homed in on the separation of the lighter and darker races of men as the crux of the racial divide at the time when the influence of American slavery's effects were still sending visibly damaging aftershocks through society, especially in the form of legal segregation. You can think of Plessy versus Ferguson, and anti-black violence, such as lynching, fueled by white supremacy. These aftershocks continue to shake the global landscape today. I explicitly consider Du Bois and Stover here because their theoretical interventions, which center the divide between black and white, are implicated in the wider division among white, white other, and black, denoted by what I call the interracial color line. Furthermore, the social, psychological, and historical problems that their respective works address are inseparable from the matter I want to cover regarding victimized black males and their voices, which often remain unheard when it comes to their being victims of violence, and that is murder, police brutality, rape, intimate partner violence, or IPV, and even adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, such as neglect and molestation. Othello is actually a useful entry point into this conversation because this play involves a lone black male character and a narrative that depends on the presence of a nefarious white other, Iago, who instigates the drama's engagement with white supremacy, sex, violence, and racialized anxiety. Othello dramatizes the interracial color line and how the white other and the color line sustain black subjugation, sometimes with lethal consequences, that are no less relevant to real black men outside of the play. Othello thrives on its villain Iago's ability to generate racial discord and manipulate and coerce psychologically all those around him, not just Othello. While critics have noted Iago's skill in this regard, they have yet to reflect on it with consideration of the intraracial color line, specifically in terms of white-on-white violence, or the perverse intimacy we see between the play's white men. Iago's role as the play's primary white other, as a sort of hype man for white supremacy, and how his role as the white other allows him to use sexualized discourse with or about white men to facilitate his abuse of Othello. As the villain, and as a white man, Iago's mediation of emblematic blackness, symbolized by his morally and ethically corrupt behavior, is quite evident based on the criteria I outlined in the preface. Without that discourse in mind, though, or with it in mind, I want to highlight a few key moments from Othello before transitioning to a discussion that more broadly centers blackness in relationship to whiteness. As Othello illustrates, and even warns, it is dangerous for black people not to pay attention to whiteness, and it is equally dangerous to center whiteness without critique. That is the lesson Othello fails to learn by trusting the white other too much, and by not trusting himself enough. In being far more fair than black, as the Duke suggests, Othello registers as an assimilated black man. Yet, the racist trauma he experiences in the opening scenes of the play indicates the limits of the whiteness he is perceived to embody. To the detriment of his household and himself, and the state too, Othello internalizes the anti-black racism that surrounds him in Venice and Cyprus. And as a result, he lives a life and a lie of self-doubt molded by myriad experiences with racism. As such, I reinforce in this chapter another of my book's central arguments, that examining whiteness from an anti-racist perspective requires the simultaneous analytical centering and decentering of whiteness from the critical promised land that Othello does not reach, partly because it would have been impossible for Shakespeare to lead him there, and more importantly, leave him there. I define the play's sex violence system as a structure that is deeply dependent on blackness, and in this play especially, the black man and his body. This pre-modern white dependence on somatic blackness and figurative blackness in order to establish the parameters of the ideal white self and white other is a troubling precursor for so much violence and trauma that historically followed Othello with respect to interracial relations. And now, maybe second to last thing I'll read. This is my favorite section of the book, because I got really creative with my writing, as you'll probably hear, and I get to swear. So my mom doesn't really like this section. That's okay. So this section is called, and for the undergrads in the room, I guess one of the reasons why I wanted to share this with you too is because it shows you how you can play with language, even as you're making an argument that is a critical argument, rooted in, the sort of creativity that one can engage in with writing. So this section is called In Bed with Iago, Mind-Fucking White Men. Iago's mind-fuck game is so good. With skill, he performs like the kind of partner who satisfies himself as well as those with whom he engages in what I call his intercourse discourse. The meaning of this section's title is multifaceted. It establishes how a white man, Iago, is a mindfucker. It establishes how white men in this play can be mind-fucked. It queers and calls attention to Iago's figurative and somewhat violent sexual activity with a few of the play's white men. And it signals how there is a perverse psycho-racial component to the narratives Iago creates around race and sex, narratives that eventually allow him to master Othello and seduce him mentally. In the examples I explore in this chapter, the bed is a literal and metaphorical intimate object, material object, tied to Iago's intercourse discourse that is designed to perpetuate the play's intra-racial tension and anti-Black racism. Iago's intercourse discourse is itself rooted in racism and designed to produce violent outcomes in the public and private spheres. When we hear of Iago in bed with Cassio, another of the play's white men, in Act 3, Scene 3, a moment where we and Othello essentially become oral voyeurs, left to imagine an impassioned, sleep-talking Cassio sensually touching and kissing Iago as if he were Desdemona, we witness the play's conflation of the erotic, homoerotic, homosexual, intraracial, and interracial. As noted, Iago literally claims to have been in bed with Cassio, but in a sense, he also brings Desdemona into that bed. Under the guiding Christian assumption that man and wife are one, by proxy, the imagined Iago as Desdemona also invokes the presence of a jealously displaced Othello. And this also recalls, because I was talking with Professor Balbuena's students about Hamlet earlier, it recalls Hamlet's mother language that emerges when he's talking to Claudio, or Claudius rather, and wants to have him leave for England. Iago becomes the embodied intersection of race, gender, and sexuality. In multifaceted ways, the white man displaces the lawful Black husband and marginalizes him, removing his spousal patriarchal power. In bed with Iago, Othello can only be the white woman, Desdemona, if he can be anything at all, as Iago's words imply. The interracial marriage gets whitewashed in this fantasy. Relaying his fabricated tale about occupying the same bed as Cassio, Iago fills Cassio's mouth with words and speaks them to Othello. He says, "In sleep I heard Cassio say, 'Sweet Desdemona, let us be wary, let us hide our loves.' And then, sir, would he grip and wring my hand, cry, 'O sweet creature,' then kiss me hard as if he plucked up kisses by the roots that grew upon my lips. Then laid his leg over my thigh and sighed and kissed and then cried, 'Cursed fate that gave thee to the Moor.'" In our minds, we imagine Cassio uttering his sweet words to Iago, a white man. Yet Iago positions himself as a surrogate for the white woman, Othello's wife. Iago's erotic, wet dream, and that's W-H-E-T, that is to say, the sexualized dream vision he concocts to whet or sharpen Othello's desire to kill Desdemona and tear her all to pieces, is itself an example of how sex, race, silence, and violence merge in this play. Using the white man Cassio to facilitate his sexual manipulation, Iago coerces Othello into believing his wife Desdemona cuckolds him. By not resisting Cassio's advances in this story, Iago becomes a willing, whorish Desdemona who violates domestic decorum by succumbing to and therefore confirming Cassio's intense desire for her, as evidenced by the aggressiveness, if not outright violence, of his touching and kissing. Manufacturing this story allows Iago to transform Othello into a figurative cuckold, while performing emotional and psychological rape on the Black man, whose vehement call for Black vengeance signifies the success of Iago's mindfuck, for he gets Othello to come to the conclusion that he must kill his wife. This dream vision serves other purposes as well: to define Cassio, whom Iago hates, as a betrayer of their general, and to elevate Iago's professional and social status as he transitions from being Othello's ancient to being his lieutenant and confidant. In pitting Othello against Cassio and Desdemona, Iago successfully fractures the interracial household and orchestrates a complex scenario that involves intra-racial violence designed to induce interracial violence, as white male dominance often can. Again, I say, Iago's mindfuck game is so good. It is in fact what helps set the play's intraracial and interracial conflict in motion through the villain's relentless insistence on Othello's supposed barbarous difference that marks him as an outsider in Venice. Mindfucking is what Iago excels at. He creates and or capitalizes on white people's psychological malleability and instigates intraracial tension in ways leading to the interracial conflicts that make Othello into a pathetic victim of racism and racial exclusion. As the play's pornographer, so to speak, Iago's sexual imagery gets everyone wet with anxiety. In other words, in Othello's first scene, Iago activates the play's racial conflict when he charges that Brabantio's domestic possession, his daughter, has been stolen by a black Moor. Iago removes Desdemona's agency and stereotypically criminalizes Othello's actions. And so we can see a sort of emergence there of stereotypes that we still see playing out in our world today. And he complicates the issue when he calls attention to the interracial aspect of Desdemona's union, which occurred without her father's consent, a move that ignored traditional social expectations related to the courtship and marriage processes. Iago's anti-black rhetoric fuels Brabantio's racial paranoia by promoting a false narrative about theft. Moreover, he capitalizes on Brabantio's concerns about blackness through his sensational sexual imagery when he says, "Even now, very now, an old black ram is tupping your white ewe. Arise, arise, awake the snorting citizens with the bell, or else the devil will make a grandsire out of you." Less detailed, but no less vivid than his elaborate dream vision seduction of Othello, Iago's manipulation of Brabantio is alarming nonetheless, because it directly relies on exploiting the racial tension, intraracial and interracial, between white and white, that is, white father and daughter, Desdemona and Brabantio, and white other and black, Brabantio, Iago, and Othello. Forcing Brabantio to visualize the black man having sex with his white daughter Desdemona, Iago succeeds in generating intraracial domestic conflict that is a byproduct of interracial tension, specifically his hate for Othello. There is even an air of homoeroticism in Iago's figurative language, given that the word you, E-W-E, sounds like you. In other words, the white self. By extension, Brabantio, the white man, is also being tupped by the black man, given that Iago's language furthers the uncontrollable black phallus's reach, and given that an early modern audience would have understood Desdemona as her father's property and thus a part of him. Iago's association of Othello with the devil and his suggestion that Brabantio's lineage will be blackened in various ways reveals how much he understands both of the familial implications and the interracial marriage and the power of anti-black racism. According to Ariane M. Balizet, because of the understanding that lineage is physically manifest in the blood, or bloodline, then as now, children were often described as literal extensions of the father's blood. In essence, Brabantio's family line would become stained through Othello and Desdemona's progeny through the mixed blood, thus reflecting badly on Brabantio's patriarchal power, since the imagined grandchild would serve as incontrovertible proof he could not control his daughter's wayward passions. His household is out of control. Moreover, Iago's repeated usage of now, coupled with awake, creates a sense of urgency because peace has been disrupted by the white, not black, devil. The anti-black animalistic description of interracial sex deepens the anxieties produced by this speech because boundaries of all kinds are crossed, with race being the most central one. Iago subtly highlights age as another factor, defining the couple's incompatibility beyond race, and Rodrigo soon compounds the perceived problems with this union by emphasizing class and cultural differences, with attention to sexuality. For instance, he calls Othello a lascivious Moor. Furthermore, Iago's physical position in the street symbolizes the integration of the public and private spheres, since he orders not just Brabantio to awake, but the common citizens too. He publicizes this private household conflict making it relevant to all Venetians, to all white people in the broader landscape. As white other, Iago exists to stoke fears and instigate a divide between the black man and the white Venetians. And so I'm going to stop there and really quickly transition before I open up to questions, and just kind of bring you into this virtual reality space that I created, because and there are students here from Professor Valbuena's class, right? Yes? Couple? No? Any? Yes, okay. So you can help me out if you remember what we talked about earlier. But I created this, does this come off? Yes. I created this gallery space because, as I said, I wanted to, and there's music in it, so that's going to come on in a second too, I think. Yes. But I created this gallery space because I wanted to give both the general public, but also you all, an opportunity to think about how you can visualize the concepts from the book. So I'll take you into it. And again, as I said, you don't need virtual reality goggles to access this. You can just use your keyboard, as Professor Valbuena's students quickly figured out earlier today. And so this is the David Sterling Brown gallery that I created, and I'm just going to get in here. And again, you just use the arrow keys to navigate and your mouse. Let's see, I'm using a computer that I'm not familiar with, but I got it. And so I'm going to go over to this image and back up so you can see it, and kind of explain to you how the concepts from the book are operating. And of course, again, if anybody, or even Professor Valbuena, if you want to help me out too. But this is an image from Macbeth, for instance. And for those of you who don't know, the Macbeths are not good people. They kill their king who comes to visit them, so they're not very good hosts. And they're actually in the front of the image here, in the foreground of the image, this print image. And then in the background, you have two sort of figures who are not implicated in the murder of the king. But then what's really interesting about this image to me is the middle. So this is like, I'm not sure now. There's a board here on the table, and next to the board, if you look sort of diagonally to the left of the board's head, you see another head there. And that's the ghost of Banquo's head, who is also a casualty in this play. And what was really interesting to me as I was going through thousands of images from the Folger Shakespeare Library, and this gallery has 39 images in it, is that I was able to see the concepts of the book play out in terms of thinking, one, about this division between whiteness in terms of ideal whiteness or less than ideal whiteness, which we can think about as, like, say, a sinful character, like the Macbeth sort of fit into that less than ideal character or category. And what's interesting is how dark they appear in the frame, and how that is contributing. Like I talked with Professor Valbuena's students earlier, and just some of the descriptors that were coming out in terms of thinking about what's being reflected here through the color symbolism, very similar to what we can think about that gets mapped on sometimes to black bodies. So even though these are white characters, the idea that they are violent, that they're aggressive, that they're sinful, that they're not good, that's all coming out through this blackness in this image. But then in the background, we have these sort of good characters. And if you look at the top left and then move diagonally, you can see that there is actually a diagonal line of light separating the foreground from the background. That really does give us a sense that even this artist had some sense of how there is this division between goodness and, call it badness, if you will, or the ideal white characters and the less than ideal. And so in the gallery, you can access any of these images and have a look around. But I just found this to be fascinating. I'll actually show you one more that we looked at earlier today from Hamlet, where, again, studying this image, so if you can see, I know it may be hard for you all in the back, but this image that's sort of centered here is Hamlet in the final scene of the play. And what the students notice as very fascinating about that is how, again, you have this black or blackened figure centered with these sort of lighter, whiter characters all around him. And we started to just talk about the implications of what does it mean to have the bad character covered in blackness, right? Because we see that in films, we see it in television shows, and that's doing work unconsciously for us. And that's really what I figured out with these Shakespeare plays, and even some of the language. Juliet has some beautiful language in Romeo and Juliet, but when you look closely at it, she's actually playing up the notions of blackness as bad in comparison to Romeo, who is presented as fair and sort of majestic-like. And so all of this is here for us to consider and think about. But I wanted to just show you that really quickly before I open it up to questions, because it's a place that you can play in, of course. You can create an avatar, and it can look like you a little bit if you want. But it's a great opportunity to just get into the concepts and learn them visually as opposed to just thinking about words. So on that note, I'm going to stop there and thank you all, and I'll open it up for questions. So thank you. But questions for you? Oh gosh. I don't know who's first. Somebody help me out here. We'll go that way. Yes.
Okay. First, I said, what goes through your mind, or like what have you experienced in your past, and so now just like create such weird characters, weird intersectionality?
Oh, sorry. Say that a little louder. I should pass this. I want everybody to hear your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Sincere Fielder, and the question I have here is like, what goes through your mind, or what have you experienced in your past that's allowed you to like create such layered characters, be it intersectionality? Because like I know like you touched on like current issues like gender, homosexuality, trauma, mental health, and etc. So like I know like for you to be like emotionally in tune and like just that sensibility, like, how does it like affect that?
Wow. You get a book. I'm over. You get a book. You get a book. That was a phenomenal question, and okay, so I hope everybody heard that question. I'm really glad you asked that question because it is so relevant to the very last words of my book. So in the final chapter, the conclusion, I'm actually closed the book with a letter that I wrote when I was 18 years old because I was being racially profiled by police in my neighborhood. And I got stopped 4 times by 3 different police officers over 6 months. So from December, December 2001 to I think like March, April 2002, and that had been weighing on my mind. And so I think I'm really, because usually I read that when I do these things, and I didn't. I kind of wanted to kick myself for it. But I'm glad you picked up on the emotional connectivity to my work despite me not reading that, because I don't want to always sit in trauma when I'm talking about race or being a black gay man. And so it really became a driving force for me. And my dad actually presented, because my dad's a bit of an archivist, as I was telling people at lunch today, and he presented that letter to me, and I always wanted to do something with it to help me sort of get over the trauma that I had. And I decided in 2020, 2021 that I was gonna somehow put that in this book. And Melissa Jenkins, she's back there, she knows, she was with me through this whole process. She's read everything I've ever written, I swear to God. And I decided that I wanted to end the book with those words, and I was gonna have to figure out how am I gonna get there through Shakespeare. And so that's what I did. And it is a very sort of emotional ending. There's also diagrams. This letter that I wrote, I sent it to the mayor, police chief, and police commissioner of my town. And that was when I was 18. And I like to share that story with undergrads in particular because this all happened right after it started happening right after I got my early decision acceptance to Trinity. And so that's a place where I work now, and it's I'm constantly reminded of that past moment of trauma. I've dealt with it now, and I think writing the book was really cathartic for me. But that's how it got in there, so thank you for asking that. Yeah. And I'm happy to put my name's already on the book, your name in the book after we're done here, so just come up to the front and I'll sign it. Yes, who else? Yeah. Oh, give you this, right?
You touched on a little bit, you were talking a little bit about pre-modernity.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious, when thinking about Shakespeare, which was written sort of in a pre-European colonialist, like when those racial constructions weren't fully developed, do you notice any major differences or similarities when thinking about our modern constructions of race and how that's connected to Shakespeare's construction of race?
I want to stay here all day. This is another good question because, yes, there's so much connectivity. And what was your name?
Oliver.
Oliver, thank you, Oliver. There's so much connectivity. One of the things that people get sort of confused about is race is not a biological construct, right? Race is a system that is very much about power. And if you look at work like by like Barbara Fields, for instance, there's a book called Racecraft, and that helps us understand how, in fact, it's not race. Like we're thinking about which comes first, chicken or the egg. It's not that complicated, right? Racism is what produces race because we need this sort of hierarchical distinctions, and well, we don't need them, but we need them in order to maintain these imbalances that we have in our society. And so what you see in Shakespeare's world, and even before his world actually, so there are medievalists, the period before mine, who have, like, I'm thinking of someone like Geraldine Hang, for instance, who have written about this and explored the work of like Chaucer, etc., to help us see in our modern 21st century world that while things were different on some level, they weren't really all that different. In the 1590s, for instance, Queen Elizabeth I issued some edicts to banish blackamoors from England. And there were some economic concerns around that, very similar to kind of what we're seeing in the United States right now in terms of wanting to export people because of competition for resources or they're threatening or whatever. And so it's not really all that much different. So yeah, but it's a great question because there's a lot of connectivity there. Who else? Oh, you had, yes, you did. I can't actually, I don't feel like that's fair. I gotta go over there, but I'll go. Here you go.
I appreciate that. My name is Audrey, and you mentioned Claudia Rankine, Bell Hooks, and Toni Morrison in the preface. What other authors would you encourage students to explore?
Oh gosh, so many. I don't know, Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk, Audre Lorde. I think I'm very into this book. There's a lot of sociologists whose work I touch on. So Matthew Huey is a sociologist at the University of Connecticut, and I think his work is really fascinating. He gets us to think about race and gender and intersectionality. Gosh, you stumped me there. Hey, I have a bibliography. No. But yeah, I mean, in terms of thinking outside of my field, because, I did a lot of work outside of my field. Let's see, I mean, even poetry, right? Like, poetry by Jericho Brown has informed how I think about stuff. And if you don't know his work, you should. He had a new poem just dropped in the New Yorker recently called Black Dictionary, and it is fire. But really anything that I can sort of get my hands on, thinking of Crystal Fleming as well. There's lots of books on like how to be an anti-racist or Hood Feminism by Mickey Kendall. Just so many works, but definitely was inspired by a lot of Black feminists in particular as I was doing my thinking in this book. More questions? I moved over here. Okay. Sorry. I'm gonna go to the back here. Yeah. Oh, there we go.
So you talk about the idea of the white others.
Mhm.
How do you think that can connect looking at the ideas of othering Native Africans in the colonial world?
In terms of, so like
Native Africans. It might be a different terminology, but the othering of them based on like their cultural phenomena, religions, religious practices, marriage practices, ideas like that.
So I think, I would connect it just in terms of thinking again about these processes of exclusion that we want to create, because people, I don't want to, but people want to create these hierarchies, right? Because when you're othering people, it's because, as Toni Morrison says in this interview she has with Charlie Rose, like, if you need to do that to make yourself feel tall or whatever, or make me I have to be small, it's because you want to maintain these boundaries, and they're invisible boundaries, again, these processes of exclusion. So I think it has a lot to do with that. But thank you for that question. What else? I gotta go to the back. I'll give you one, I'll come back to you. I feel like I'm doing a talk show here. There you go, Wendy Williams now.
Hi there, my name's Josh. You previously used the metaphor of inheriting a sort of broken home.
Mm-hmm.
In the face of ongoing and ever-evolving efforts to sort of undermine diversity, equity, and inclusion, how do you see your work and more so your creation of art through words as serving as sort of a counterforce or an infrastructure to this degrading home?
Yes. Wow. Like, can you repeat that? Can I have your phone so I can read that? So one, I have to give credit. So the house metaphor, I was trying to remember earlier. So that comes from Isabel Wilkerson. I did mention her book, Caste. Can you just say that one more time, like loudly for me, so I can?
Of course. In the face of ongoing efforts to undermine diversity, equity, and inclusion, how do you see your work in sort of creation of art through words as a counter to this?
Yeah, okay. It's so tough, because sometimes it's discouraging, because, you know, we see everything that's happening right now with DEI, for instance, but I see this work as my passion. And I grew up so I'm a former first-generation college student, first in my family to get a PhD and do this whole thing, and I see it as my duty to honor the people who helped me get here. Like, before I had Melissa Jenkins in my life, I had Dr. Ruby Shaw, who I thank in the acknowledgments of my book, and she was a community activist in the town that I grew up in, and despite all the odds being, you know, against people for whatever reasons, whether it's because of class or race or gender or sexuality, it doesn't mean that we can't try to make strides. And even if my book is just a half a drop in the bucket, it's still something, and I think that's better than doing nothing. And I will always think that. And so, yeah, that's what I see. I mean, I was thinking about the advice I got from the vice provost at my first job, and he said that when you produce scholarship, he's like, just kind of make your goal that you want to change the world. Doesn't mean that I will, but if you make that your goal, like, you might, right? Or at the very least, you know you're going to be doing work that you're proud of. So that's my answer to that question. And you've had your hand up for a while, so I'm coming over there and just get your book. And then I will come back to you. But yeah, thank you for that question.
So thank you for coming. My question is, considering the growing racial divide in the United States currently, how can we take your ideas that you've so beautifully given to us, how can we take that to change whiteness, to prevent the othering, excluding, and extorting black and brown people in the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So that's, yeah, if you read the book. We have to see these things. So first and foremost, I think a lot of people are in denial, right? And so when I said earlier that I see the concept of the white other play out in the world, in the gallery, let's see if I can go to that, I have a piece that I wrote, and it's on my website, but it is posted on Claudia Rankin's Racial Imaginary website, Institute website as well. But this is an article that I wrote where I am sort of taking, so it's called Untucked, White Supremacy Along the Color Lines, and it is very much about my fellow Trinity alum, Tucker Carlson. What I'm doing there is getting people to, like, we can't do anything if we don't see the problem, right? And so even when I watch my favorite soap opera, I have two, The Bold and the Beautiful and The Young and the Restless. Been watching since 1998. Oh, yeah, you watched?
Don't even go there.
Oh, you watched?
Not a chance.
Oh, okay. I see this play out with, like, the villain is it might be the white woman, but she's got the dark hair. There's something dark about her, right? And so if unconsciously that is sending a message to me that, like, black is bad, I have to be aware of that so that I'm not letting it do the work that it might be meant to do on me. So I think that's one thing. And then the other thing is, you know, there's all this talk about, like, anti-racism, et cetera. I think I saw this really great video on Instagram the other day, and the woman was like, forget about anti-racism. She's like, think about, are you a safe place or safe person for the person who essentially has less than you in society? So we're thinking about race, right? Like, are you a safe place for black people? Am I a safe place for women as a man, right? And that means I need to understand, there has to be criteria that I need to meet in order for me to be able to say that. Am I a safe place for somebody who has a disability, right? Because I have this able-bodied privilege, or able-bodied dominance, if we want to go in Claudia Rankin's direction. And so what am I doing to undermine that? Because the world was built for able-bodied people. The world was built for men. We live in a patriarchal world. It's not something that I like, but it is true. Like, so what am I doing to undermine that? That means that when I'm at my job, you know, and I have a new colleague who's a woman come in, I'll share with her what my salary is because I know what that means for women in the workaday world in terms of how men make more just because we're men. That's not okay. So we have to take active steps to mitigate these issues and combat them by being aware and taking action. So instead of ally, people like to use that word. Nikki Kendall in Hood Feminism, she uses the word accomplice, and I think that's a better term because like if I'm your accomplice, like we're in this together, and I'm by your side. So great question. What was yours?
I was wondering, I know you're specifically studying white others in Shakespeare, interested in Othello, but have you seen or studied examples of the white other in more contemporary literature right now?
So great question. This is not me studying. This is more contemporary than Shakespeare, what I'm about to say, but I'm just excited to share this in case anybody is in the room and likes this stuff. So I am on a dissertation committee for a young PhD candidate at Yale, and she actually reached out to me a year ago and was like, oh, I read your book, and I'm working on a dissertation on Russian literature. And she actually sees the role of the white other as playing out in Dostoevsky's texts and other Russian literature, particularly with the peasant white woman figure. And so, yeah, and I was both shocked, but also when I started reading her dissertation, I was like, oh no, I actually see this. So it is there in more contemporary literature. And even in contemporary, whether it's film or, honestly, I've even seen this on like reality TV. So it's really interesting though how we create, again, these divisions in our world to help sort of reinforce certain types of dominance. But yeah, so thank you for that.
My question was kind of similar, but I feel like listening to your prologue, so many of the observations you made about race and othering could apply to so many other texts, and like especially in the realm of like classic literature. So what made you specifically want to look at Shakespeare?
I kind of had to answer a question like that in Professor Wayne's class earlier. Because when you want to be a professor, you have to get this thing called tenure, and so you got to write a book. No, I really like Shakespeare in terms of what the canon allows me to do. So I feel it's limitless. Like sometimes I'm teaching classes that involve discussions around mental health, and we can have that conversation using Shakespeare. And so it's not always race. Sometimes it's a conversation about, as I touched on in the book, sexual violence. And Shakespeare allows me to do that. I'm sure there are other authors who can do that, but I just gravitated towards Shakespeare partly because it was the thing that made my educational progress click for me in undergrad, and so I latched onto it. I had no idea what I was doing in grad school, that's for sure, but figured it out. And I think that, just having the sort of breadth and depth that Shakespeare has, and then all these allusions, and also sometimes I do pair Shakespeare with African American literature. There are a lot of allusions to Shakespeare in African American authors' texts, like Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk has this beautiful line of blank verse, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. And I think that is so apt because if we lived in that world, like it would be so great. But yeah, that's really, and also had a really great Shakespeare professor. So she kind of won there. Yes. Missing anybody in the middle? Okay. I'm like, we'll figure this out. We'll just have to send more books. I didn't give you the microphone. Sorry. There you go.
I thought it was particularly interesting when you mentioned Iago's engagement with homoeroticism, acting as a sort of medium to advance his malicious intentions as the white other. What exactly are the implications of specifically using homoeroticism in that context?
Sorry, say that one more time. I'm doing too much at once.
What exactly are the implications of specifically using homoeroticism in that context as Iago is acting as the white other?
Yeah, I mean, I think it compounds actually the nature of what the white other represents in terms of thinking about that figure as an outsider, right? As if we think about these dichotomies of insider, outsider, and it also reinforces again the hierarchical nature of what we see in sort of any dynamic like that. So take race out of the equation, right? We live in a society that also centers heteronormativity, right? And so I think queering that moment calls more attention to the white otherness in a way, and not because there's anything wrong with being queer, but that's what these texts do, right? Because we want to keep things normal. And so that's a really great question, a really complex question, but absolutely easy. Thanks for that. Who did I give that book to?
Come steal it.
I don't know. Somebody will. Okay.
Hi, my name is Grace. My question is more on like the analytical side of like criticisms or like incorporation of your work with other scholars, or just in general, like have you seen a difference across audiences, let's say like between white and non-white people, readers who are engaging with your work? Like, have you seen a difference? Have you, maybe that's more of an analytical question.
No, it's an interesting question. So it's kind of hard to say and hard to tell because, so the book came out, it may seem like a long time ago, it came out in October 2023, but I guess in the academic world, which can move slowly sometimes, it's not that long ago. But what I find interesting, to answer your question, is that I've been surprised about the reception that I have received from on the book in England, which is essentially what I'm kind of critiquing, especially in my introduction when I think about the history of England, the attempts to erase the presence of black people in England, and it's actually been well received, which I have a colleague, who wrote another book and mentioned they're sort of surprised at the reception as well. So that's something I would say, but no, in terms of a racial breakdown, that's the best answer I can give in terms of thinking about England, which when I go to Stratford-upon-Avon, I'm like one of two black people there. So it's a very white space, but, and it's also Shakespeare's birthplace, but I guess a testament to the book and its reception might be what Professor Jenkins said is that I'll be going to England. I was invited by the mayor of Stratford-upon-Avon to come be the keynote and scholar at the center of the Shakespeare birthday celebration. And in his letter, he mentioned it's because of my book. So I think it's kind of been neutral in that respect, which I'm glad about. Yeah. Okay. Oh, and I'm like, I need more mics. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
I wanted to ask about the conceptual distinction you make between the ideal white and the white other.
Mm-hmm.
In the context of Iago, it sounds like what made him like a white other was the way that he was parasitic on blackness in order to elevate his status. But in my mind, I guess like whiteness is always parasitic on blackness, and so I wanted to ask how you make the distinction between who is a white and a white other.
So it's not me. It's really what the dominant culture standards are in the given text or in a given moment, right? And so even as Matthew Huey, who I'm pulling that from, in his scholarship, he has a great book called White Bound. But I am thinking about what is the dominant culture in this world that Shakespeare has created? How are they defining what is ideal, what is good, and what is not? But also, again, I mean, we think about Iago as a character who is just willy-nilly spewing, racist discourse. I mean, there's nothing good about that. So I think he's an obvious target for thinking about what and who represents what the white other is. I think a more sort of challenging example from that text would be Desdemona, who I also put in that bucket. But when we think about it, we can look at the example of like Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, right? And even in the sort of modern day perspective, from my vantage point, he's kind of been cast into this category of the white other, right? Because he has aligned himself with a black woman, and now he's got a biracial child. very much giving Titus Andronicus, in a way, sort of in the reverse. But yeah, so I think it's really about how the dominant culture defined it. So I'm more so looking at the evidence that they're giving me and then drawing the meaning out of that. But thank you, that was a really good question.